Prior to August 19, 1991, the story of high technology trade with the Soviet Union was relatively uncomplicated. The 15 republics which comprised the USSR had a single limited demand for doing business with American high-tech companies. There was slow and predictable growth with comparatively few risks. One of the most vigorous advocates for Soviet-American trade has been Bill Claggett, Director of Economic Development for the city of San Jose.
And so there are some huge market opportunities for our companies, and it's going to take some time to develop them, but they're there. And I think I'm very optimistic about the prospects of that for companies here. Well, the biggest concern I have is whether they're going to be able to develop that infrastructure, that organizational infrastructure that will enable them to make the system work.
Then came the coup in the Kremlin. Suddenly, everything else was put on hold. But long before the attempted overthrow of Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, and in fact long before Vladimir Ilyich Lenin came to power, Western companies were doing business in Russia. For example, Americans were selling pencils, wheat, and soft drinks. In recent years, major corporations ranging from AT&T to Xerox put an optimistic foot in the door with varying degrees of success. And in spite of the political shock waves which have emanated from the USSR recently, business goes on. Some law firms, such as Baker McKenzie, have even opened offices in Moscow.
Everybody views the business climate as having gone through a very radical change for the better. Yes, there's uncertainty, but the changes definitely have come for the better. It is a signal that politics aren't going to rule investment decisions.
The United States and its allies trade many different kinds of products with the Soviet Union, but for high-tech companies, the rules are a bit tougher, and the stakes are much higher. The level of Soviet technology varies widely, but most engineers in the USSR lack the resources of their Western counterparts. Brilliant researchers often must work with primitive tools. Vital equipment is frequently out of order or unavailable.
I would say the following, that if you look at their ideas, then they are not far off the United States. But when we look at the execution, at the types of machines they are producing, then the assessments are 10 years off, 8 years off. Some people go as far as, say, 15 years off.
However, those who work on high-priority government projects use the best equipment in the world, including some things which are officially prohibited by COCOM. That's the Coordinating Committee for Multilateral Export Controls. COCOM is an international body which restricts the sale of sensitive technology.
COCOM remains a very significant body. And most recently, we've seen a new set of directives, particularly in the telegraph and telephonic and electronics area, that are a liberalization, but they are by no means an absolute free trade provision.
The historical trade relationship between the Soviet Union and the United States has put American companies in an unfavorable position compared to their European and Asian competitors. U.S. government regulations add another layer of restriction to what may be shipped to the USSR. Of course, that hasn't always stopped prohibited goods from entering the Soviet Union. Much Soviet technology is the result of reverse engineering. That's the practice of studying a finished product to determine how it was designed. But some technology was originally developed in the USSR. For example, ferrite memory, automatic control machines, and early anti-missile systems were all pioneered by the Soviets.
And I'm afraid that the present problem is that in spite of glasnost, we don't know still too much about Soviet computer industry because it's tied in with the problems of national security of the Soviet Union.
Perhaps the greatest handicap facing the Soviets today is their seriously deficient infrastructure. For example, only 30% have telephones at home. Experts predict it will take 10 years just to build an adequate communication system. And by the end of this decade, it's estimated Soviets will need 20 million personal computers to meet the anticipated demand. Today, there are probably only about 400,000 PCs in the USSR.
We don't know for sure, but maybe we've reached a saturation level in PCs in the West. But the Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union, if we have around 150 PCs per thousand population, they have one.
Renowned Sovietologist Marshall Goldman describes himself as one of America's leading pessimists when it comes to the economy of the USSR.
Well, right now the Soviets aren't worried about technology, they're worried about bread on the table. They're worried about the lowest possible technology. If they don't get that, the society is going to collapse. They were thinking about technology in their glory days when they were involved in space efforts and military efforts. And the technology mainly came in through that direction if it wasn't related to some national priority. Then there really wasn't that much technology. In those areas where there were priorities, then they did some things that were reasonably impressive.
One of the great concerns American companies have had about doing business with the Soviets is the ability to get profits out of the USSR. The traditional problem has been this: the ruble.
The ruble is not truly a convertible currency today. There is a commercial rate that the Soviets have established, but it's far from the mark, if one will, of what a freely traded currency would represent. This has been a major impediment. The Soviets have worked long and hard. They're proceeding cautiously because this has implications far beyond just convertibility of currency. It impacts their price norms. Many items in the Soviet Union today are subsidized. And they're subsidized at prices that were in existence 30, 40, 50 years ago.
We don't have industrial policy in this country at all. But we badly need some kind of an industrial policy with regards to the Soviet Union. We cannot rely just on big or small American companies dealing each in their own way with huge Soviet Union. With regards to high technology, because of its tight connection to national security problems, I think the participation of the American government is highly desirable.
So which way will things go from here? Those who dare to make predictions tread on dangerous ground, but some are quite optimistic.
We look for some international cooperation to state some joint ventures, some mutual projects with foreign companies, and we believe that soon we will be not the first, of course, maybe not the second, but I see on the third or fourth position in the world if our plans will fulfill.
The economy is very fragile, and the populace, while we saw them well up and support democracy, I think we must be somewhat careful in interpreting that as necessarily an endorsement of economic reform across the board. The mass of the population in the Soviet Union has not to date seen the benefits of perestroika.
Peasant finds that his chickens are dying, so he goes to the local priest and he says, "Father, tell me what to do, my chickens are dying." The priest says, "Feed them aspirin." Feeds them aspirin. Sees the priest a few days later, he says, "Well, what happened?" He says, "Well, it didn't work, another 50 died." Feed them penicillin. Feeds them penicillin, sees the priest a few days later, "What happened this time?" This time 100 died. Feed them castor oil, that'll do it. Feeds them castor oil, sees the priest, "What happened?" This time they all died. Oh, the priest shakes his head. "Oh my, what a pity, what a tragedy. I have so many other ideas I wanted to try." Well, that's basically the way the Soviet people feel about Gorbachev and his advice. They're the ones that are going through this process, and he keeps giving advice, and it's all wrong.
As the political drama in the USSR continues to develop, many important questions remain unanswered. But one thing is clear: Americans still want to do business with the Soviets. Terry Phillips, Silicon Valley Report.